My wife spent 9 months saying the baby wasn't mine, so I believed her. My wife Jessica started her little joke the day she found out she was pregnant. She'd pat her stomach and say, "Hope the baby has Doug's eyes instead of yours." Doug was her co-worker who she carpooled with sometimes. She'd laugh and say she was kidding, but then she'd do it again an hour later. At first, I tried to laugh along because pregnancy hormones make people say weird things, but Jessica never stopped. Every single day, she'd make at least 5 comments about the baby not being mine. When we went to the first ultrasound, she told the technician, "Wow, it looks just like my friend Doug already." The technician looked confused, and Jessica laughed, saying she was joking, but then whispered loud enough for everyone to hear that the baby had Doug's nose for sure. When we told her parents about the pregnancy, Jessica said, "We're having a baby." Well, I am anyway. Who knows who the father is? Her mother looked horrified, and Jessica said, "Relax, Mom, I'm kidding," but then winked at her dad like it was their inside joke. At the baby shower, Jessica gave a speech thanking everyone for coming, then said she wanted to especially thank Doug for all his contributions to this blessing. People shifted uncomfortably, and she said what I mean, his emotional support during the conception period. I mean pregnancy period. Oops, did I say conception? The room was dead silent, and Jessica laughed, saying everyone was too sensitive these days. She did this everywhere we went. At the grocery store, she'd tell random strangers that I was raising another man's baby, but I didn't know it yet. At prenatal classes, she'd introduce me as her husband who thinks he's the father. At work events, she'd joke about how the baby was going to have features that definitely didn't come from my gene pool. When I confronted her about it, she'd cry and say I was being controlling and couldn't take a joke. She'd say she was dealing with pregnancy stress through humor, and I was making everything worse by being so insecure. Then 5 minutes later, she'd text her sister about how the baby was moving, just like Doug moves when he's excited. I asked her directly if she'd been unfaithful, and she got angry, saying how dare I accuse her of cheating when she was carrying our child. But then at dinner, she'd say things like, "Technically it's my child, you're just assuming you're involved." My friends started asking if everything was okay. My brother pulled me aside and said Jessica's behavior wasn't normal. My mother straight up asked if I needed a paternity test, but Jessica would tell everyone I was being paranoid and jealous and that she'd never been with anyone else. Then she'd immediately make another joke about Doug being the real father. The breaking point came in the delivery room. Jessica was in labor for 12 hours, and the whole time she kept saying she wanted Doug there to meet his baby. The nurses kept looking at me with pity. When it was time to push, Jessica screamed that she needed to tell me something important. She grabbed my hand and said, "The baby really isn't yours. I need you to know that before it's born." I stood up and said, "Okay, then I'm leaving." Jessica screamed, "What are you doing?" I said, "You've told me every single day for 9 months that this baby isn't mine. You've told family, friends, strangers, medical professionals, and now you're telling me during delivery. So I believe you. I'm not raising another man's child. Good luck with Doug." I started walking toward the door, and Jessica completely panicked. She started sobbing, saying, "Wait, no, please, I was joking, it's yours, the baby is yours, I swear." I turned around and said, "No, Jessica, you don't get to torture me for 9 months, then take it back now. You were very clear that Doug is the father, so call Doug." The doctor tried to intervene, saying emotions run high during labor, but I said she's been saying this for 9 months, not just today. Jessica was hysterical, begging me to stay, saying she'd never been with Doug or anyone else. Her mother rushed in, and Jessica screamed at her to tell me the truth. Her mother looked confused and said, "What truth?" Jessica said, "Tell him about the bet. Tell him about the stupid bet." Her mother went white and said, "Jessica, no, you didn't actually do it." That's when everything came out. Apparently, Jessica and her sister had made a bet about whether I'd stay if Jessica constantly implied the baby wasn't mine. Her sister said modern men were weak and would leave at the first sign of doubt. Jessica bet $5,000 that I'd stick around no matter what she said because I loved her. She thought it was a fun way to prove her sister wrong and make easy money. She'd been documenting everything to show her sister that I was the perfect husband who trusted her completely. The room went completely silent. I stood there frozen while Jessica kept screaming my name from the bed, and her mother moved between us with her hands up like she was trying to calm down a wild animal. Her mother's voice was quiet but firm when she said I should go wait in the other room and cool off for a minute. The doctor turned back to Jessica and told her she needed to focus on pushing because the baby was coming whether we sorted this out or not. Martha the nurse touched my arm so gently, I almost started crying right there, and she guided me toward the door, saying she'd been doing this job for 20 years and had never seen anything quite like what just happened. I walked out into the bright hallway, and the door closed behind me, and suddenly I could hear Jessica screaming again. But this time, it was because of contractions, not because of me leaving. The waiting room had those uncomfortable plastic chairs that are somehow too hard and too soft at the same time. I sat down and put my head in my hands and listened to my heart beating so loud I thought other people might be able to hear it. My phone started buzzing in my pocket, and I ignored it the first 2 times, but when Blake called for the 3rd time, I finally answered. I told him everything that happened in the delivery room, and he was quiet for a long time before he said he was getting in his car right now. I said it was 2 in the morning, and he said he didn't care. I said he didn't need to come, and he said yes, he did, and then he hung up. I sat there staring at the floor tiles and counting them because I needed something to do with my brain that wasn't thinking about the bet or Jessica's face when I started walking away. Blake showed up 40 minutes later still wearing his pajama pants under his jacket. He sat down in the chair next to me and didn't say anything for the first 5 minutes. We just sat there together while people walked past us, going to visit their normal families, having their normal babies without any insane bets involved. Martha came out through the double doors and walked over to where we were sitting. She said Jessica had delivered a healthy baby boy about 20 minutes ago, and both mother and child was doing fine physically. She stopped talking for a second, and I could tell she was trying to figure out how to say the next part. She said Jessica was asking for me and crying, but she wanted me to know I didn't have to go in there until I was ready. Martha's eyes were kind when she looked at me, and I appreciated that she was treating me like I had a choice in this. Blake asked what I wanted to do, and I realized I actually had no idea. Part of me desperately wanted to see my son, but another part of me couldn't stand the thought of being in the same room as Jessica right now. I looked at Martha and said I needed to see the baby, but could I do it without Jessica being there? Saying those words out loud made me feel like the worst person in the world, but Martha just nodded like it was a completely reasonable request. Martha said she could arrange for the baby to be in the nursery where I could see him through the window. She led us down another hallway to a big window, looking into a room full of plastic bassinets with tiny babies inside. Martha pointed to one in the front row and said that was him. I pressed my hand against the glass and looked at this incredibly small person I helped make, and I started crying for the first time since this whole nightmare started. He had a little blue hat on, and his eyes were closed and his hands were curled up into tiny fists. Blake stood next to me, and after a minute he said the baby had my nose. I started laughing and crying at the same time because it was such a Blake thing to say, and because he was right. Jessica's mother appeared next to me at the window, and I hadn't even heard her walk up. She said she was so sorry for not stopping Jessica months ago when she first heard about the bet. Her voice was shaking, and she looked about 10 years older than she had this morning. She explained that Jessica's sister had always been competitive and mean, and she honestly thought Jessica would stop the joke after a few weeks when she realized it wasn't funny. She said she never imagined her daughter would keep it going for 9 whole months. I turned to look at her and asked how she could let this go on for so long without saying anything. She wiped her eyes and admitted she didn't know the full extent of what was happening until tonight. Jessica apparently told her family she was just making occasional jokes and not the constant daily torture that actually happened. She said if she'd known Jessica was doing it every single day and telling strangers and medical professionals, she would have put a stop to it immediately. A woman in a gray cardigan walked up to us and introduced herself as the hospital social worker. She asked if she could talk to me privately for a minute, and we moved away from the nursery window. She wanted to know if I had somewhere safe to stay and if I needed any resources for the immediate future. Her questions were careful and gentle, and I suddenly realized she was trying to figure out if this situation was going to turn violent or dangerous. The thought hadn't even occurred to me until that moment. I told her I was staying with my brother and that I wasn't a danger to anyone. I said I was just hurt and angry and confused about everything that happened. She nodded and pulled a card out of her pocket and handed it to me. She said the first few days after a birth were emotionally intense, even without major relationship trauma added into the mix, and I should call her if I needed anything at all. Blake drove me to his apartment as the sun was starting to come up over the buildings. I sat in his passenger seat watching the empty streets go by and feeling completely numb. When we got inside, I finally let myself fall apart completely on his couch. I cried so hard I thought I might throw up, and Blake brought me water and a blanket without saying anything. He said I could stay as long as I needed, and then he went to his bedroom and left me alone with my thoughts about how my wife had spent 9 months treating our marriage like a game she could win. I woke up on Blake's couch with my phone buzzing against the coffee table, and when I picked it up, the screen showed 17 missed calls from Jessica, 12 from her mother, and 3 from her father, who I'd only met maybe 4 times in the 3 years Jessica and I had been together. There was a text from Andre that just said, "Heard what happened, you okay?" And I realized word was already getting around about what happened in the delivery room. My whole body felt heavy and wrong, like I'd been hit by a truck, and I sat there staring at all those missed call notifications, wondering if any of this was actually real, or if I'd wake up and find out the last 9 months had been some kind of nightmare. I called Andre back because he was the only person I could talk to right now, without feeling like I wanted to scream or throw my phone through Blake's window. He picked up on the first ring, and I told him everything from the delivery room confrontation to Jessica's mother's face when the bet came out to me walking away while Jessica was literally in labor. Andre didn't say anything for so long, I actually pulled the phone away from my ear to check if the call had dropped, but then he finally spoke and said that was the most messed up thing he'd ever heard in his entire life. He asked where I was staying, and I told him Blake's apartment, and he said he'd come over with some of my stuff since I'd left the hospital with nothing but my wallet and my phone in my pockets. I hadn't even thought about needing clothes or a toothbrush or anything practical because my brain was still stuck on the image of Jessica's face when I started walking toward that delivery room door. Andre showed up about 2 hours later with a duffel bag full of my clothes and toiletries and a bag of takeout food from the Chinese place near our house. We sat at Blake's kitchen table eating fried rice and orange chicken and not talking about anything important until Andre finally put his fork down and asked what I was going to do about the baby. I stopped chewing and just looked at him because I'd been trying really hard not to think about that exact question since I left the hospital. I told him I honestly didn't know because the baby didn't do anything wrong and he was my son, but I couldn't imagine having to see Jessica multiple times a week for the next 18 years to do custody exchanges. Andre nodded and said that was fair, and then asked if I'd thought about getting a lawyer, and I realized I hadn't thought about anything beyond getting through the next 5 minutes without losing my mind completely. My phone rang while we were finishing the food, and I saw it was a number I didn't recognize, so I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick it up anyway. The voice on the other end said this was Jessica's father, Ruben, and he asked if we could meet for coffee because he needed to talk to me about what happened. I wanted to say no, because I didn't want to deal with anyone from Jessica's family right now, but there was something in his voice that sounded broken and tired, so I agreed to meet him at a diner near Blake's apartment in an hour. Ruben was already sitting in a booth when I got there, and he looked like he'd aged about 10 years since I saw him at Christmas. His face was gray, and there were bags under his eyes, and his hands were shaking a little when he lifted his coffee cup. He started talking before I even sat down and said he didn't know about the bet until Jessica's mother called him from the hospital last night and told him everything. He said he was disgusted that his daughter would treat her marriage like some kind of game show and that he'd raised her better than this, and he didn't know where he'd gone wrong. I sat there listening to him apologize and feeling weird because part of me wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, but another part of me was still too angry to comfort anyone from Jessica's family. Ruben said he understood if I couldn't forgive Jessica and he wouldn't blame me for leaving, but he hoped I wouldn't shut out my son because of his mother's mistakes. I told him I wasn't trying to abandon my son, but I needed time to process that my wife had spent 9 months deliberately messing with my head for money, and that I didn't know how to get past that kind of betrayal. He nodded like he understood, and then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope and slid it across the table toward me. I opened the envelope, and inside was a check for $5,000 made out to me, and I just stared at it, not understanding what I was looking at. Ruben explained that he'd gone to Jessica's sister's house that morning and demanded she give him the bet money, and now he was giving it to me as a small gesture toward trying to make things right. I felt sick looking at that check because this was what my pain had been worth to them. $5,000, and Jessica had been willing to torture me every single day for 9 months to win this money from her sister. I told Ruben I didn't want their money, but he said to take it anyway because maybe I could use it to pay for a lawyer since he figured I'd probably need one soon. I folded the check and put it in my wallet, even though touching it made my skin crawl, and then Ruben and I sat there in silence for a few minutes before he paid for the coffee and left. My phone rang again on the walk back to Blake's apartment, and this time it was a number from the hospital, which meant Jessica was calling from a hospital phone since I'd blocked her cell number. I almost didn't answer, but I picked up on the last ring and immediately heard Jessica crying so hard I could barely understand what she was saying. She was begging me to come see the baby and talk to her, and saying she knew she'd messed up, but we could fix this if I just came back. I stood on the sidewalk outside Blake's building and told her there was nothing to fix because she'd broken something that couldn't be repaired, and she started hyperventilating so badly that I heard a nurse take the phone from her. The nurse asked me very politely to please not upset the patient, and I hung up feeling guilty and angry at the same time because somehow I was the bad guy for not wanting to comfort the person who'd spent 9 months torturing me. I went back up to Blake's apartment and sat on the couch staring at Ruben's check and trying to figure out what I was supposed to do with blood money from my wife's cruel bet. Blake came home from work around 6 and found me still sitting there holding the check, and he asked what it was. I explained about meeting Ruben and how he'd gotten the bet money from Jessica's sister and was giving it to me, and Blake's face got red, and he said that was blood money, and I should rip it up right now. We argued about it with Blake saying I shouldn't take a single dollar from those people, and me pointing out that $5,000 could pay for a divorce lawyer, which was something I was definitely going to need. Blake went quiet when I said the word divorce, and I realized this was the first time I'd said it out loud, and it made everything feel more real and permanent. The next morning, my phone rang while I was still half asleep on Blake's couch, and I grabbed it without looking at the number. A woman's voice introduced herself as the hospital social worker and said she needed to discuss discharge plans for Jessica and the baby. She explained they were releasing them tomorrow and asked about my living arrangements and whether I'd be involved in custody. I sat up and felt panic spread through my chest because I hadn't thought about any of this beyond getting through each moment. She asked if I had legal representation, and I said not yet, and she told me I should probably get some soon because these situations can get complicated fast. After I hung up, I stared at my phone for a few minutes, trying to figure out what I was supposed to do about custody of a baby I'd only seen through a nursery window. Blake came out of his bedroom and asked if I was okay, and I told him about the call. He reminded me that Andre had given me a lawyer's number yesterday and said I should probably call her today before Jessica got home and made decisions without me. I found the number in my wallet next to Ruben's check and called the lawyer Andre recommended. A woman answered and said her name was Haley Zimmerman and she could see me at 2 that afternoon if I could make it to her office downtown. I agreed and spent the rest of the morning trying not to think about what I was going to tell her. Blake offered to come with me, but I said I needed to do this alone. Haley's office was in a building near the courthouse, and when I got there, she brought me into a small conference room with a box of tissues on the table. She asked me to tell her everything from the beginning, and I did, starting with Jessica's first joke about Doug and ending with the bet revelation in the delivery room. Haley listened without interrupting and took notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she put down her pen and told me I had options, but I needed to move quickly before Jessica established sole custody by default. Haley explained that if I wanted any kind of custody arrangement, I needed to be involved from the start. She said courts look at who's taking care of the baby right now when they make custody decisions later. She told me I needed to see my son regularly, even if I wasn't ready to deal with Jessica because otherwise I'd be giving up my rights without meaning to. Then she asked if I'd even held the baby yet, and I felt shame wash over me as I admitted I hadn't. She didn't judge me, but she said I needed to fix that today because every day I stayed away made it easier for Jessica to claim I'd abandoned them. I told her I'd go to the hospital after our meeting, and she said that was a good start. She asked if I wanted her to draft a temporary custody proposal, and I said yes, because I didn't know what else to do. I drove straight to the hospital from Haley's office and went up to the maternity floor. Martha was at the nurse's station, and when she saw me, her face softened. I asked if I could see my son in the nursery again, and she said something better and led me to a private room instead. She left and came back a few minutes later carrying a small bundle wrapped in a blue blanket. When she placed him in my arms, he opened his eyes and looked right at me. His face was so small and perfect, and I felt something break open inside my chest that hurt and healed at the same time. Martha left us alone, and I sat in the chair holding my son and trying to understand that this tiny person was mine. He made small sounds and moved his hand against my shirt, and I couldn't believe Jessica had used him as part of a bet. I sat with my son for what felt like both minutes and hours, just holding him and watching him breathe. I tried to figure out how I was supposed to be his father when I couldn't stand to be in the same room as his mother. Martha checked on me twice, and the second time she asked what his name was. I realized Jessica and I had never actually agreed on a name because we'd been fighting about it for months. She wanted to name him after her grandfather, and I wanted to name him after my dad, and we'd never reached a compromise. I told Martha we hadn't decided yet, and she said they needed a name for the birth certificate soon. I was about to say something else when I heard a sound from the doorway. Jessica was sitting there in a wheelchair, and I went stiff immediately. She just sat there crying without making any noise while I held our son. She looked terrible with dark circles under her eyes, and her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Neither of us said anything for a long moment, and then she whispered that she wanted to name him after my father if that was okay. I was so surprised I almost dropped the baby, because we'd been arguing about names for months, and she'd refused to even consider my dad's name. She said she knew it didn't fix anything, but she wanted me to know she was sorry, and naming him after my father was the only way she could think to show it. I told Jessica we could name him after my dad, but that didn't change anything between us. She nodded like she'd expected me to say that, and more tears ran down her face. We sat in painful silence for a few minutes with me holding our son and her watching from the doorway. A nurse came in to take the baby back for feeding, and Jessica asked if I was coming home. Her voice was so small and hopeful that for a second, I almost said yes. I told Jessica I was staying with Blake for now, and we'd figure out custody arrangements through lawyers. She started crying harder and said she couldn't do this alone. I reminded her that she chose to make a bet about our marriage, and now she had to live with the consequences of treating me like an experiment. She asked how long I was going to punish her, and I said I wasn't punishing her. I was protecting myself. The nurse took the baby and left, and Jessica and I sat there looking at each other across a distance that felt like miles. She asked if I'd at least come visit the baby at home, and I said I'd figure something out through my lawyer. Then I left before she could say anything else. Jessica's mother drove her and the baby home from the hospital the next day. She texted me photos of them getting settled in the nursery I'd spent weeks painting last month. I looked at the pictures of my son in the crib I'd put together and the changing table I'd assembled and felt completely disconnected from that life. It was like looking at photos of someone else's family in someone else's house. Jessica's mother sent another text asking if I wanted to come see the baby later, and I didn't respond because I didn't know what to say. Haley called me that afternoon and said she'd drafted a temporary custody proposal. She explained it would give me regular visitation while keeping the baby primarily with Jessica since she was breastfeeding. The proposal included overnight visits once the baby was a few months old and taking him for weekends when he was older. I listened to her describe how I'd be a visitor in my son's life and felt sick. I told her it sounded practical, and she said she'd send it to Jessica's lawyer once I hired one for her. I agreed to everything because what else could I do? After I hung up, I sat on Blake's couch and thought about how I was going to be a part-time father because my wife made a bet. My son would grow up knowing his dad didn't live with him, and someday I'd have to explain why. I'd have to tell him that his mother spent 9 months making jokes about him not being mine, and I'd believed her enough to walk away. I put my head in my hands and tried not to think about all the moments I was going to miss because Jessica wanted to win $5,000 from her sister. 3 days later, I drove to the house to get more clothes because I was running out of clean stuff at Blake's place. I parked in the driveway and sat there for a minute staring at the front door that I'd walked through 1,000 times before. Everything looked exactly the same from the outside, but I knew nothing inside would ever feel the same again. I used my key and went in quietly, hoping Jessica might be asleep or at her mother's house. The living room was a mess with baby supplies everywhere and dishes stacked on the coffee table. I headed straight for the bedroom but stopped when I heard soft crying coming from the nursery. I looked through the doorway and saw Jessica sitting in the rocking chair, holding our son against her chest. She looked terrible with dark circles under her eyes and her hair pulled back in a messy knot. Her shirt had spit up stains on the shoulder and she was rocking back and forth while tears ran down her face. For just a second, I felt bad for her because she looked so exhausted and alone. Then I remembered why she was alone, and the sympathy disappeared. I turned away and went to the bedroom to pack. I pulled my duffel bag from the closet and started throwing clothes into it without really paying attention to what I grabbed. Jessica must have heard me moving around because she appeared in the bedroom doorway still holding the baby. She asked if we could talk, and I told her I was just here to get my stuff. She said she knew I was angry, but maybe we could try counseling to work through this. I kept packing and told her I didn't know if there was anything to work through. She started crying harder and said she loved me so much, and that's why she made the stupid bet in the first place. She wanted to prove to her sister that our marriage was unbreakable and that I would never leave her no matter what. She said her sister was always telling her that modern men can't handle anything and that I'd probably run at the first sign of trouble. Jessica thought she could prove her sister wrong and make easy money at the same time by showing that I trusted her completely. She kept listing all these reasons why she loves me while I shoved socks and underwear into my bag. She said I was patient and kind and always made her laugh. She said I was going to be an amazing father, and she couldn't imagine raising our son without me. She said the bet seemed harmless at first, and then she got in too deep to stop. I zipped up my bag and turned to look at her. I pointed out that she spent 9 months trying to prove our marriage was strong, and instead she broke it completely. The irony of that seemed pretty obvious to me, but apparently it hadn't occurred to her until I said it out loud. Jessica's face crumpled, and she started sobbing so hard the baby woke up and started crying too. She sat down on the edge of the bed and tried to calm him down, while tears dripped onto his little head. She admitted between sobs that she never actually thought I would leave. She said she believed I'd be hurt and upset, but that I'd forgive her eventually because that's what I always do. She said she counted on me being the person who stays no matter what, and she was so sure she'd win the bet. She rocked the baby and whispered that she was an idiot, and she destroyed everything good in her life for $5,000. Listening to her talk, I realized she was right about one thing. I did always forgive her for stuff. When she forgot my birthday last year, I forgave her. When she spent our vacation fund on a shopping spree, I forgave her. When she made jokes at my expense in front of our friends, I forgave her. I'd spent our whole marriage being the understanding husband who let things slide because I loved her. That's probably exactly why she thought this bet was okay to make. She knew I'd be upset, but she also knew I'd get over it because I always did. I picked up my duffel bag and told her I was done being the person who accepts whatever she dishes out. She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes and asked what I meant. I said I meant I was tired of being treated like my feelings don't matter, and I'm not going to keep forgiving her just because that's what I've always done before. She reached for my hand, but I stepped back and walked out while she was still crying. I got back to Blake's apartment and dropped my bag on the floor, feeling completely drained. An hour later, Andre showed up with beer and pizza, saying Blake texted him that I might need some company. We sat on the couch, eating and drinking, and Andre talked about random stuff like his new project at work and some movie he watched last weekend. He didn't mention Jessica or the baby once, and I was grateful for that. It was the first time in days that I felt almost normal sitting there with my best friend just existing without having to process anything heavy. Andre knew exactly when to push me to talk and when to just let me be quiet. After he left, I realized how lucky I was to have people like him and Blake who showed up for me without making it weird or complicated. The next evening, I drove back to the house because I needed to see my son, even if it meant dealing with Jessica. When I got there, Jessica saw me pull up and immediately grabbed her purse and left through the back door to give me space. I found my son in his crib staring at the mobile above him. I picked him up and sat in the rocking chair holding him close while he made little baby noises. I stayed for 2 hours just being with him and then left before Jessica came back. The The next night, I did the same thing, and Jessica made herself scarce again, either going to her mother's place or hiding in the bedroom. It was awkward and painful, knowing we were avoiding each other in our own house, but at least I was building a relationship with my child. Every evening I'd show up around 6 and Jessica would disappear, and I'd spend time with my son. We developed this weird routine where we never had to see each other, but we both got time with the baby. My son was 2 weeks old when someone knocked on Blake's apartment door at 9 at night. Blake opened it, and I heard a woman's voice saying she needed to talk to me. I walked over and saw Jessica's sister standing in the hallway. She started to say something, but I shut the door in her face without saying a word. She immediately started yelling through the door about how it was just a joke and I was overreacting. She said Jessica was falling apart, and I was being cruel by refusing to forgive her over something so small. She kept shouting that it wasn't that big of a deal, and I needed to stop being so sensitive. Her voice got louder as she said, "Families forgive each other," and I was destroying my marriage over nothing. I stood on the other side of the door shaking with anger, while she continued her rant about how I should man up and get over it. Blake walked over and opened the door just enough to tell her that if she didn't leave right now, he was calling the cops. Jessica's sister said she had every right to be there, and she wasn't leaving until I talked to her. Blake pulled out his phone and started dialing, and she finally backed off. Before she left, though, she shouted one more time that I was destroying my family over a stupid joke, and someday I'd regret being so stubborn. I heard her footsteps going down the hall and then silence. I sat on the couch with my hands shaking and my heart racing. Blake sat down next to me and said some people are just broken inside and there's nothing you can do to fix them. He said Jessica's sister was one of those people who would never understand why what she did was wrong. 2 days later, Haley called with an update on the custody situation. She said Jessica's lawyer had reviewed the proposal and Jessica agreed to everything without fighting it. I was surprised because I expected her to push back or ask for changes, but apparently she just signed off on the whole thing. Haley said the temporary custody arrangement would start right away, giving me regular visitation while keeping the baby primarily with Jessica since she was breastfeeding. Then Haley paused and said Jessica's lawyer had asked if I'd be willing to try couples counseling before we moved forward with divorce papers. Haley said it was completely up to me, and she'd support whatever I decided. I told her I wasn't sure about counseling, and I needed time to think about it. She said to take all the time I needed and let her know when I made a decision. I told Haley I'd think about it, and we hung up. That night, I lay on Blake's couch, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was giving up too easily on my marriage. Part of me thought maybe I should try counseling because we had a kid together, and shouldn't I at least try everything before calling it quits? But then I remembered Jessica's face in the delivery room when she thought I was actually leaving. She only panicked when she realized I was serious about walking away. She only cared about losing me when it became real instead of theoretical. All those months of jokes and comments about Doug being the father didn't bother her because she knew I'd stay. She only started caring when I called her bluff and proved I had limits after all. I rolled over and pulled the blanket up trying to sleep, but my mind kept spinning with the same questions over and over. The next morning I called Haley and told her I'd try one counseling session just to see if there was anything worth saving. She said she knew someone who worked with couples dealing with trust issues and she'd send me the contact information. The therapist's name was Dr. Roberts, and her first available appointment was the following Tuesday, which gave me a week to prepare myself for sitting in a room with Jessica where I couldn't just walk out. Haley sent over the details and I stared at the appointment confirmation on my phone, wondering what I was getting myself into. That afternoon, I went to the house to see my son and found Jessica in the nursery feeding him. He turned his head when I walked in and made a little sound like he recognized my voice. I sat down in the chair across from them and watched him eat while Jessica stayed quiet. When he finished eating, I took him and held him against my chest, and he settled right down instead of fussing like he used to. Jessica stood in the doorway watching us with this look on her face like she wanted to say something but didn't know how to start. I could see how badly she wanted to talk to me, but I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. I stayed for an hour just holding my son and letting him grab my finger with his tiny hand. Before I left, Jessica asked if I'd confirmed the counseling appointment, and I said yes without looking at her. The week dragged by slowly with me going to the house every evening to spend time with my son. He was starting to know me now and would calm down when I picked him up. Jessica kept her distance most of the time, but I'd catch her watching from doorways or peeking into whatever room I was in. Tuesday came faster than I wanted, and I met Jessica at Dr. Roberts' office in a building downtown. We sat in the waiting room on opposite ends of the couch, not talking, until the therapist called us back. Dr. Roberts was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and kind eyes who told us to sit wherever we felt comfortable. Jessica immediately started crying before anyone even asked a question. Dr. Roberts handed her tissues and waited patiently while Jessica tried to pull herself together enough to speak. When Jessica finally started talking, she explained the whole thing about the bet and her sister saying modern men were weak. She talked about how her sister had always been competitive with her and made her feel like she had to prove things. Dr. Roberts listened without interrupting and then turned to me and asked how I felt about everything. I told her I felt like I'd been married to someone I didn't actually know, because the person I thought I married would never torture me like that for 9 months. Jessica started crying harder, and Dr. Roberts asked her to take some deep breaths. The session was brutal, with Jessica sobbing through most of it while trying to explain why she thought the bet was okay. Dr. Roberts asked Jessica if she understood why constantly telling me the baby wasn't mine was harmful, and Jessica nodded, but kept saying she thought I knew she was joking. I pointed out that jokes are supposed to be funny, and there was nothing funny about spending 9 months questioning if I was about to raise another man's child. Dr. Roberts wrote some notes and asked Jessica if she had a pattern of seeking her sister's approval. Jessica admitted that she did, and that her sister's opinion mattered more to her than it should. Then Dr. Roberts asked the question that seemed to hit Jessica hardest, which was whether she'd considered my feelings as important as winning the bet. Jessica went quiet for a long time before admitting that no, she hadn't really thought about my feelings at all. She said she was so focused on proving her sister wrong and winning the money that she didn't consider how much damage she was doing. Dr. Roberts asked if Jessica understood why that was a serious problem in a marriage, and Jessica finally seemed to grasp how big of a thing she'd actually done. Her face changed like something clicked in her head, and she looked at me with this expression of real understanding for the first time. We left the session with homework assignments about rebuilding trust that Dr. Roberts printed out for both of us. I took my packet and walked to my car without saying anything to Jessica. That night she texted me saying she understood if I couldn't forgive her, but she hoped I'd give her a chance to prove she'd changed. I didn't respond because I wasn't sure I wanted to do the work the therapist assigned. The next day, Blake asked me over breakfast if I was going to try to make the marriage work. I told him I didn't know, and he said that was okay, but I shouldn't do it just because we had a kid together. He reminded me that plenty of people co-parent successfully without being married, and that I deserved to be with someone who treated me with basic respect. His words stuck with me for days while I went through the motions of visiting my son and avoiding real conversations with Jessica. Dr. Roberts scheduled our second session for the following week, and I went even though I wasn't sure why. This time I told the therapist right away that I wasn't sure I could get past the betrayal, no matter how much work we did. Dr. Roberts said that was a valid feeling and asked what I needed to feel safe in the relationship again. I couldn't answer because I honestly didn't know if anything could fix what Jessica had broken. Jessica asked what she could do to make this right, and I told her honestly that I didn't know if anything could fix it. She looked devastated, but Dr. Roberts said that honesty was important even when it hurt. We left that session with more homework, but I still wasn't doing any of it. My son turned 6 weeks old, and I realized I was spending more time at the house than at Blake's apartment. Jessica and I were having actual conversations again about normal things like what the pediatrician said or when the baby last ate. The conversations were careful and stayed on the surface, but they weren't hostile, which felt like some kind of progress. One evening, Jessica showed me her phone where she'd blocked her sister completely on every platform. She said she'd also started seeing her own therapist to work on why she needed her sister's approval so desperately. I looked at the blocked contact and the therapy appointment confirmations and appreciated that she was trying, but I still wasn't sure it was enough. Part of me wanted to believe she could change, and part of me thought I was being stupid for even considering it. We went to our third counseling session, and Dr. Roberts noticed that we were sitting closer together on the couch. She asked if I was willing to move back home on a trial basis to see if we could rebuild what we'd lost. I said I'd think about it, and Jessica looked hopeful for the first time in weeks. Her whole face lit up just from me saying I'd consider it, which made me realize how low her expectations had gotten. I called Andre the next day and asked if I could come over to talk. He said sure, and when I got to his place, he had coffee ready and we sat on his back porch. I told him I was thinking about moving back home, and he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked if I was doing it because I wanted to, or because I felt obligated. I sat there for a minute trying to figure out how to answer, and finally admitted I didn't know the difference anymore. Andre nodded and said that was probably something I needed to figure out before making any decisions. He wasn't being harsh about it, but he wasn't letting me off easy either. We talked for another hour about what I actually wanted, versus what felt like the right thing to do. By the time I left, I still didn't have answers, but at least I knew what questions to ask myself. I spent the next 2 days thinking about it, and finally decided I'd move back home, but sleep in the guest room. It felt like a reasonable compromise between being present for my son and protecting myself from getting hurt again. I texted Jessica and asked if we could talk, and she called me immediately. I told her my decision, and she agreed so fast I barely finished explaining. She said she was just grateful to have me in the house, and would respect whatever boundaries I needed. We spent an hour on the phone establishing rules about communication and respect and personal space. Jessica wrote everything down and said she'd print it out so we both had copies. When I moved back in 3 days later, the printed boundary list was on the kitchen counter with Jessica's signature at the bottom and a space for mine. Living together again was strange in ways I hadn't expected. We were polite to each other like roommates who happened to have a baby together. We coordinated childcare and took turns with night feedings, and kept our interactions focused on practical things. There was no intimacy or warmth between us, but there also wasn't hostility. We existed in the same space and took care of our son, and avoided talking about anything deeper than diaper changes or pediatrician appointments. I kept my stuff in the guest room, and Jessica stayed in our bedroom, and we gave each other space. The house felt bigger somehow, with both of us trying not to take up too much room. My son was growing and hitting his milestones, and I was there for all of it, which felt important. But every night I'd go to the guest room and close the door and wonder if this was sustainable long term. Jessica knocked on my door one night about 2 weeks after I moved back. I opened it, and she was standing there in pajamas looking nervous. She asked if I thought I'd ever be able to forgive her. I told her honestly that I didn't know. She nodded and said she understood, and we stood there for a minute not knowing what else to say. Then she said goodnight and went to her room, and I went back to mine. Neither of us brought it up again, but the question hung in the air between us. My son turned 3 months old and started smiling at everything. Jessica was making dinner one evening and said something about how the baby smiled at the ceiling fan like it was the most interesting thing in the world. I laughed without thinking about it, and then caught myself. I realized I was starting to relax around her again, and it scared me. I didn't want to forgive her too easily, but I also didn't want to hold on to anger forever. That night, I lay in the guest room thinking about how exhausting it was to stay mad all the time. But then I'd remember her face in the delivery room, and the anger would come rushing back. I felt stuck between wanting to move forward and needing to protect myself from getting hurt again. We had another counseling session scheduled, and I wasn't sure what I was going to say. When we got there, the therapist noticed something had shifted between us. She asked if we were ready to talk about moving forward instead of just processing the past. Jessica looked at me with this hopeful expression, and I said maybe. The therapist seemed pleased and gave us new homework about rebuilding intimacy in small steps. Jessica cried in the car on the way home and thanked me for being willing to try. I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure I was ready for her gratitude yet. 4 months after I moved back into the house, I packed up my stuff from the guest room and moved it back into our bedroom. It felt both familiar and completely foreign at the same time. Jessica was at the grocery store with the baby, and I wanted to do it while she was gone so it wouldn't be a big production. When she came home and saw my clothes in the closet, she started crying. She put the baby in his swing and came over and hugged me and thanked me for giving her another chance. I told her we were taking this one day at a time, and she nodded against my shoulder. That night, we slept in the same bed for the first time in months, and it was awkward. We stayed on our own sides and didn't touch, and I barely slept. But it was a start, I guess. Jessica's mother came to visit the following week and asked if she could talk to me privately. We sat in the kitchen while Jessica played with the baby in the living room. Her mother apologized directly for not stopping the bet, and I could see she genuinely felt bad about it. She said she'd cut off Jessica's sister temporarily because she needed to learn that actions have consequences. I appreciated her saying it, even though it didn't change what happened. She asked if there was anything she could do to help, and I told her just keep supporting Jessica's therapy. She promised she would and gave me a hug before she left. My son hit 5 months old and was thriving. He was rolling over and laughing and reaching for things. I'd catch myself thinking that maybe we could actually make this work. Jessica had been going to therapy every week without me having to remind her. She respected my boundaries and gave me space when I needed it. She was proving through actions that she understood what she did wrong. We had good days and bad days, but the good days were starting to outnumber the bad ones. One night after we put the baby to bed, Jessica asked if we could talk. We sat on the couch and she brought up what would happen if she ever did something like this again. I looked at her and told her clearly that there wouldn't be another chance. If she betrayed my trust again, I'd be gone and I wouldn't come back. She promised she understood and said she'd spend the rest of her life making this up to me. I wanted to believe her, but part of me would probably always be waiting for the other shoe to drop. A few weeks later, Andre came over for dinner, and I watched him observe how Jessica interacted with me and the baby. She was attentive without being pushy, and gave me space when I needed it, and asked before touching my arm or getting too close. After we ate, Andre asked if he could talk to me outside, and we stood on the back porch while Jessica cleaned up inside. He looked through the window at her washing dishes and said he could see she was really trying, and it seemed genuine to him. I told him I was cautiously optimistic, which felt huge compared to where I'd been 6 months ago when I couldn't even look at her. Andre clapped me on the shoulder and said that was good enough for now. The next week, Jessica brought up our anniversary coming up in 2 months and asked if I'd consider renewing our vows as a way to start fresh. I was surprised to find myself actually thinking about it instead of immediately saying no. We sat at the kitchen table after the baby went to sleep and talked about what that would mean and what promises we'd make this time. Jessica said she wanted to acknowledge what she did instead of pretending it never happened, and I agreed that felt more honest than trying to recreate what we had before. She said it would be like building something new instead of fixing something broken, and that resonated with me in a way I didn't expect. Over the next few weeks, we planned a small ceremony with just close family and friends in our backyard. Jessica spent hours writing her vows and showed them to me beforehand to make sure I was comfortable with what she wanted to say. They acknowledged the bet and the pain she caused and promised to spend her life earning back my trust through actions, not just words. When our anniversary arrived and we stood in front of 20 people who knew what we'd been through, I said my vows about choosing to move forward together, and I meant every single word. 6 months after the worst night of my life, I stood holding my son while watching Jessica laugh with Blake at our vow renewal party, and I realized we were actually going to be okay. It wasn't the marriage I thought I had before, where everything seemed perfect on the surface, but was actually built on me not questioning anything. This was honest now, with all our flaws and mistakes out in the open, and that was worth more than the illusion of perfection we had before.